The sun was setting when the news broke that one of the most respected Marines in the country had been arrested. Everyone in the military knew him, admired him for his service, and trusted him. His name was Sergeant Mark Stevens, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, with a record so spotless that it seemed impossible he could be accused of a crime. His story had been one of honor, hard work, and sacrifice, and now, he was behind bars, facing charges that no one could have predicted. Mark's arrest was shocking not only because of his military reputation but also because of the nature of the charges. He was accused of a crime so serious, it made people question everything they knew about him. Mark had been serving overseas in a combat zone when, suddenly, he was pulled from his duties and thrown into the middle of a scandal. The details of the charge were kept under wraps, and the military officials were tight-lipped. But the rumors spread like wildfire, and before long, everyone in Mark's unit was whispering about what had happened. His family back home in Texas was devastated. His mother, a quiet woman who had always supported her son's decision to join the Marines, couldn't believe what she was hearing. "This can't be true," she whispered to herself repeatedly as she sat in her living room, clutching the letter she'd received from the military. Mark's father, a former Marine himself, couldn't understand how his son, whom he had raised with such discipline and pride, could be facing such accusations. "He was a hero," his father muttered under his breath. "What did they do to him?" Mark's arrest had left his family heartbroken and confused. They had been watching their son rise through the ranks for years, proud of the man he had become. Mark had joined the Marines right after high school, eager to serve his country and make a difference. Over the years, he had built a reputation for being reliable, hardworking, and loyal. He was known for his quick thinking in dangerous situations, his ability to lead his team, and his unshakable moral compass. But now, his name was being dragged through the mud, and his family didn't know what to think. As the days passed, the military's investigation into the matter deepened. Everyone who knew Mark was left wondering, how could this happen? The accusations seemed so out of character for the man they all knew. Yet, the evidence against him appeared to be undeniable. How could they not believe what was being presented? Mark's friends in the military, men and women who had served beside him in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, were at a loss for words. They couldn't imagine Mark ever being involved in anything illegal or immoral. But they knew the system, and they understood that sometimes, the truth wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. The military had made its decision. Mark was being held in a military detention center, awaiting trial. The charges against him were serious, too serious to be ignored. The public had already begun to form their own opinions, and the media wasn't helping. Every news outlet in the country seemed to be reporting on Mark's case, with sensational headlines and speculative stories. "Marine arrested for serious crime" read one headline. "The fall of a hero" read another. As more details came to light, the public's perception of Mark began to change. But to his family, he was still their son, their brother, their friend. They refused to believe the accusations until they had all the facts. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. Mark's family made their way to the courtroom, where they were met with a sea of reporters and cameras. The pressure was unbearable. Mark's mother sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. His father stood beside her, his face stern, trying to hold back the tears. They were about to witness a trial that could change their lives forever, and they weren't sure if they were ready for it. As the court session began, the atmosphere in the room was tense. The judge, a stern but fair man named Judge Matthews, looked down at the young Marine standing before him. Mark stood tall, his uniform crisp, his face expressionless. He was a man who had seen so much in his life, yet now, here he was, standing in a courtroom, accused of a crime that could ruin everything he had worked for. The air was thick with uncertainty, and even though Mark's defense attorney, a calm and collected man named Mr. Jacobs, was ready to fight for his innocence, there was no telling what would happen next. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lisa Harris, presented their case first. They spoke of evidence that pointed to Mark's involvement in a criminal act. They showed surveillance footage, phone records, and witness testimonies that seemed to confirm his guilt. The case appeared to be airtight, and the jury listened intently. Mark's defense attorney tried to poke holes in the evidence, but it was clear the prosecution had done their homework. Every word they spoke seemed to tighten the noose around Mark's neck, and his family sat in silence, holding their breath. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he didn't say much. He had always been a man of few words, but now, more than ever, his silence felt like a heavy weight. His lawyer, Jacobs, spoke on his behalf, insisting that the charges were a mistake. "My client has served this country honorably for years," Jacobs said, his voice steady. "He is not the man they are making him out to be. We are confident that, when the facts are fully examined, the truth will prevail." But the prosecution wasn't backing down. They continued to paint Mark as a man who had betrayed his country, who had committed an unforgivable act. The tension in the room was unbearable. Mark's mother sat on the edge of her seat, praying for a miracle. Mark's father, usually a man of strength, looked defeated, his eyes weary from the long battle. They had hoped for the truth to come to light, but with each passing minute, it seemed less and less likely that Mark would be vindicated. Then, the unexpected happened. The judge, a man who had remained silent throughout the entire trial, suddenly stood up, his voice booming through the courtroom. "Why is this Marine still in jail?" he asked, his words sharp and filled with disbelief. Everyone in the room froze. The judge's question hung in the air, unanswered, but it was clear that something had shifted. The courtroom was on edge, and Mark's family, who had been bracing themselves for the worst, suddenly felt a glimmer of hope. What had changed? What was going on behind the scenes that no one knew? As the judge's question echoed in their minds, the courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. No one had an answer, but deep down, they all knew that the truth was about to unfold in a way no one could have expected. The story of this Marine was far from over. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the judge's words echoed through the room. "Why is this Marine still in jail?" The question hung in the air, startling everyone, including the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Mark's defense lawyer, Mr. Jacobs, had been preparing for a lengthy argument to prove his client's innocence, but he had not expected the judge to speak out like this. The prosecution, too, seemed caught off guard. They were confident in the evidence they had presented, but now, everything was starting to feel uncertain. Mark sat in the defendant's chair, his face unreadable. He had been through so much in the past few months, and now, in the most important moment of his life, he was finally starting to feel a spark of hope. His mother, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, glanced at her husband with wide eyes. She had been holding on to the belief that her son was innocent, but this sudden outburst from the judge made her wonder if the system was finally starting to listen. For a moment, it seemed like the entire room was frozen. The judge, who had been quietly observing the proceedings up until now, had spoken in a way that no one expected. His voice was calm, but his words were filled with authority. It was clear that something was not right in this case. Mark's trial was far from over, but the unexpected turn had everyone questioning whether there was more to the story than anyone realized. The prosecutor, Lisa Harris, quickly regained her composure. She was an experienced and tough lawyer, known for her ability to win high-profile cases. She had spent months preparing for this trial, and she wasn't about to let a comment from the judge derail her case. She stood up, adjusted her glasses, and addressed the court. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we have presented the facts. The evidence is clear. We have multiple witnesses who have testified, and the physical evidence supports our case. The defendant may be a decorated Marine, but that does not mean he is above the law." Her words were firm, and she spoke with the confidence that came from years of experience. But the judge, still standing, did not seem satisfied. He turned to the prosecution, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I understand that you believe your evidence is strong, but I have been listening carefully. And something doesn't sit right with me. There's more to this case than what has been presented. I want to know why this Marine, who has served his country honorably for years, is still behind bars while this investigation continues." The judge's words struck a chord with Mark's family. His mother felt a tear slip down her cheek as she clutched the edge of her husband's hand. His father, though stoic as ever, allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. They had been sitting in that courtroom for hours, listening to the prosecution's case, each piece of evidence presented with clinical precision. But none of it felt like the man they knew. Mark had always been a man of integrity, a man who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. His family could not fathom that he could be guilty of the crime he was accused of. Mark's defense attorney, Mr. Jacobs, stood up slowly, as if trying to gather his thoughts. He knew this was his moment. The judge's question had opened a window, and he needed to act fast before the courtroom atmosphere shifted again. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but with a new sense of urgency. "As you know, my client has dedicated his life to serving this country. He has risked everything for the safety of others, and now, we are in a position where we are being asked to believe he is guilty of a crime he did not commit." He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom remained quiet, the weight of the moment hanging heavy. Jacobs continued, "We are not denying that there are allegations against my client, but we believe these allegations are based on a misunderstanding, or worse, a mistake. There is no solid evidence linking him to the crime. The testimony provided by the witnesses is questionable, and the physical evidence, while it may seem convincing, is not enough to convict a man of this nature. I ask the court to reconsider its stance and allow a deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding these accusations." The judge nodded, seemingly deep in thought. He looked over at the prosecution, then back at Mark. His gaze softened for a moment before he spoke again. "I hear you, Mr. Jacobs. And I appreciate your defense of your client. But what troubles me is the speed with which this case is being handled. This is a man who has served this country with honor. If there is even a sliver of doubt about his guilt, I believe we owe it to him to pause and re-examine the situation. We cannot simply let this trial proceed as though the outcome is already determined." The prosecutor's face tightened. "Your Honor," she interjected, "with all due respect, we cannot afford to delay this trial any longer. The evidence is clear, and further delays would only serve to prolong the suffering of the victim. We must see this case through to the end." The judge looked at her, his expression unchanged. "I understand your position, but I cannot ignore the possibility that there has been a miscarriage of justice. This is not just about the victim, Miss Harris. This is about the defendant's life. And I will not rush to judgment without fully understanding all the facts." With that, the judge ordered a brief recess. The room buzzed with whispers as everyone filed out of the courtroom. Mark's family stood in silence, their eyes wide with anticipation. They had been waiting for this moment, the moment when someone would finally listen to their son's side of the story. As they walked out of the courtroom, Mark's mother could not help but feel a sense of hope, something she hadn't felt in weeks. Outside, the media had already begun to swarm. The cameras were rolling, and reporters were shouting questions at anyone who might have the answers. Mark's family hurriedly made their way to their car, trying to avoid the press. Inside, they could feel the weight of the situation, but there was a flicker of optimism now. The judge's words had opened the door to a new possibility. Perhaps, just perhaps, Mark would be able to walk free. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor and the defense lawyer met with the judge in private. They discussed the case, the evidence, and the new developments that had come to light. While the prosecution remained firm in their belief that Mark was guilty, the judge remained unconvinced. He had doubts, and for the first time since the trial began, it seemed like those doubts would be taken seriously. As the recess came to an end and everyone returned to the courtroom, there was a renewed sense of tension. Mark's future still hung in the balance, but now, there was a chance that the truth would finally come out. The judge had made it clear that he would not allow the case to proceed without a full and fair investigation. This was no longer just about a trial, it was about ensuring that justice was truly served, no matter the cost. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that was both tense and hopeful. After the judge's words, everyone knew something had shifted, but no one quite knew what would happen next. The brief recess had given the lawyers time to reflect on the arguments, but for Mark's family, it felt like an eternity. His mother, seated in the front row, wiped the sweat from her palms. The weight of the situation seemed to be lifted slightly by the judge's unexpected question, but there was still so much uncertainty. His father sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his face hard to read. Outside the courtroom, reporters were already speculating about the judge's statement. The case had taken a surprising turn, and Mark's name was now on the lips of everyone across the country. But for his family, it wasn't about the headlines or the public opinion. It was about getting Mark out of jail and restoring his name, which had been tarnished by the accusations. Back inside, the defense attorney, Mr. Jacobs, had used the recess to gather his thoughts and strategize. He was more determined than ever to prove Mark's innocence. He knew that the prosecution had a solid case, but they were missing something, a crucial piece of information that could change everything. That piece of information was about to arrive in the form of a witness who no one had expected. Mark's legal team had been working tirelessly to find any lead that could cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They knew that the evidence presented so far was strong, but there was one glaring gap: the identity of the person who had supposedly framed Mark for the crime. This question had haunted Jacobs throughout the trial. If Mark was innocent, who was responsible for the crime? It seemed almost too perfect, as though someone had orchestrated the whole thing. And then, just when hope seemed to fade, the call came in. It was a call from an unexpected source, an old acquaintance of Mark's from his time overseas. This acquaintance, someone Mark had trusted deeply, had information that could turn the case on its head. The man had been working in the area where the crime took place and had witnessed something critical, something no one had known. He had seen another soldier, someone from Mark's unit, involved in a shady deal. The witness was willing to testify in court, and he was certain that Mark had nothing to do with the crime. This information was exactly what Mark needed. His lawyer, Jacobs, immediately began preparing for the witness's testimony. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The defense team rushed to verify the witness's account and gather any additional evidence that would support his statement. They knew that the prosecution would fight back hard, but they had a real chance to shift the tide. As the recess ended and the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was even more charged than before. Everyone in the room was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. Mark sat quietly, his expression a mask of calm. On the outside, he looked composed, but inside, he was bracing for the unknown. His mother, watching him from the front row, could feel the anxiety and the hope that mingled in the air. She knew that her son had always been a man of integrity, but now, the entire world was about to learn whether justice would prevail. The judge called the court to order. The room fell into silence, and all eyes were on the bench. "We have new developments," the judge said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We have a new witness who claims to have information that may alter the course of this case. I will allow this new testimony to be heard." The prosecution's face tightened. Lisa Harris, the district attorney, had seen many twists in her career, but this was not something she had expected. The case had seemed so solid, so straightforward. Now, with a new witness appearing out of nowhere, the foundation of her case seemed to be crumbling. But she wasn't about to back down. She stood up, her posture rigid and her face unwavering. Your Honor, while we respect the court's decision to allow this new testimony, we request a full investigation into the witness's credibility. This could be an attempt to throw doubt into the case without any real evidence. The judge nodded thoughtfully. We will take the necessary precautions, but I believe the witness's testimony is worth hearing. Proceed, Mr. Jacobs. Mark's defense lawyer stood up, his face determined. He motioned to the door, and a man stepped into the courtroom. The witness was a tall, rugged man in his late 30s, his face worn by years of hard work. He looked out of place in the courtroom, his military uniform replaced by a plain suit. He walked with confidence but also a sense of hesitation, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. This was no ordinary witness. This man had information that could change everything. The witness, introduced as Sergeant Daniel Collins, took the stand. His voice was steady as he recounted the events he had witnessed months ago. I was stationed in the same area as Sergeant Stevens, Collins began, his gaze focused on the judge. I've known Mark for years, and I can tell you, he's not the man they're making him out to be. I was there, and I saw things. I saw someone else involved in this crime, someone who's been trying to cover their tracks. He went on to explain how he had seen another soldier from their unit, a man named Corporal Jason Reed, engage in suspicious activity around the time of the crime. Collins described how Reed had been seen in the area, making deals with local criminals, and how he had acted strangely in the days leading up to the incident. Mark had no involvement in this, Collins continued, his voice unwavering. He wasn't even in the area when it happened. I'm here to tell the truth, because I know what I saw. The room was silent. The judge leaned forward, listening intently to every word. The prosecutor, who had been prepared to make a strong closing argument, suddenly found herself at a loss for words. The defense team exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Collins's testimony was a game changer. It cast doubt on the entire case, and suddenly, the evidence against Mark no longer seemed so clear-cut. The prosecution had relied on witnesses who had been less than reliable, and now, a new witness had appeared, one with first-hand knowledge of the events. The implications were immense, and the courtroom felt as though it was holding its breath. As the witness finished speaking, Mark's family exhaled, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the truth had finally come to light. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to believe that their son, their brother, their friend, might finally be freed from the weight of false accusations. But the case was far from over. The prosecutor had not given up yet. Lisa Harris stood up, ready to fight back. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the witness's testimony, we cannot simply accept it at face value. We request that the court take the necessary steps to verify the witness's claims before making any judgments. The judge nodded, his face grim. We will proceed with caution. But the weight of this new testimony cannot be ignored. We will allow further investigation, and the truth will come to light. Mark's future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it seemed like there was a real chance for justice to be served. The courtroom had become a battleground for the truth, and the fight was far from over. But with the new witness's testimony, the scales had tipped in Mark's favor. The journey for justice was still ongoing, but now, there was hope. The days following Sergeant Daniel Collins's testimony were filled with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Mark's family was in a state of disbelief. They had spent so many sleepless nights worrying about his future, but now, for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of hope. The courtroom had become a place of intense focus, and every word, every gesture, was scrutinized. The prosecution was not backing down, and the defense was pushing forward with everything they had. But the new witness's testimony had shifted the momentum, and Mark's family was beginning to feel like justice might finally be within reach. The media frenzy surrounding the case had reached a fever pitch. News outlets across the country were following every development, reporting on the latest twists and turns in the courtroom drama. Headlines like "Marine's fate hangs in the balance" and "New witness testifies," the truth behind the Marine's arrest flooded the news. For Mark's family, however, it was all overwhelming. They had lived through the nightmare of seeing Mark's name dragged through the mud, and now they were faced with the task of managing their emotions as the world watched. Mark himself remained calm, despite the storm raging around him. He had always been the quiet, strong type, and his demeanor hadn't changed even as the case became more complex. Sitting in the courtroom, he tried not to focus on the reporters and cameras. His only thought was on getting out of jail and being able to return to his family. But even as he sat in that chair, waiting for the next part of the trial to unfold, there was a lingering doubt in the back of his mind. What if things didn't go as they hoped? What if the prosecution found a way to discredit the witness? It was clear that the case had become more complicated than anyone had expected. The prosecution, led by Lisa Harris, wasn't giving up. She had spent years building her career on securing convictions, and she wasn't about to let one slip through her fingers. She had been caught off guard by Collins's testimony, but now she was more determined than ever to prove that Mark was guilty. She knew that the new witness was a threat, but she wasn't going to let it derail her case. Instead, she focused on the weaknesses she saw in Collins's statement. The courtroom reconvened after a brief recess, and the tension was palpable. Everyone knew that this was the turning point. If the judge believed that the new testimony was credible, Mark's fate could change dramatically. But if the prosecution could successfully argue against it, everything could come crashing down. As the judge entered the room and took his seat, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The case had reached a critical point, and every word spoken in the next few moments would carry immense weight. Mark's defense attorney, Mr. Jacobs, was the first to speak. He stood with a renewed sense of confidence after Collins's testimony, his voice calm but full of conviction. "Your Honor," Jacobs began, "I believe we are at a critical juncture. Sergeant Collins's testimony has provided crucial new evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's case. It is now clear that my client, Sergeant Stevens, was wrongfully accused. The evidence and the witness both support the truth that Mark had no involvement in this crime." He paused, letting his words settle. Mark's family held their breath as the courtroom awaited the judge's response. "I ask that you consider this testimony carefully and with an open mind," Jacobs continued. "This is not just about clearing Mark's name, it's about ensuring that justice is done. If we allow false accusations to go unchallenged, we risk undermining everything the justice system stands for." The judge nodded, his expression serious. He turned to the prosecution. "Miss Harris, what do you have to say in response to this new testimony?" Lisa Harris stood up, her face a mask of professionalism. "Your Honor," she began, "while we acknowledge the witness's testimony, we must remind the court that it is not enough to simply present new information without verifying its accuracy. This witness, Sergeant Collins, is a former colleague of the defendant. His credibility must be called into question. His motives for coming forward are unclear, and we believe that his statement is tainted by personal bias." She paused, locking eyes with the judge. "We have no way of knowing if Sergeant Collins is telling the truth. His account is based on his own recollections, and there is no physical evidence to back up his claims. Until further investigation is done, we cannot allow this testimony to stand as the basis for overturning the charges against Sergeant Stevens." The tension in the room thickened. Mark's family exchanged glances, silently hoping that the judge would see through the prosecutor's arguments. They knew that Lisa Harris was skilled at what she did, but they also knew that she had a hard time dealing with the unexpected, and this was unexpected. The truth had come to light, and now it was a question of whether the justice system would uphold it. The judge sat silently for a moment, considering the arguments. Finally, he spoke. "I understand both sides of this case. The witness's testimony is certainly significant, but as Miss Harris pointed out, it must be verified before it can be used to determine the outcome of this trial. We will take the necessary steps to investigate the witness's claims thoroughly. In the meantime, the defendant will remain in custody until we have all the facts." The decision felt like a punch to the gut for Mark's family. They had come so close to seeing him free, but now, they had to wait. The judge's ruling meant that the investigation into Collins's testimony would take time, and the trial would be delayed even further. The thought of waiting for more weeks or months was unbearable. But they had to remind themselves that this was a step toward justice, even if it didn't feel like it in the moment. Outside the courtroom, the media was already speculating about the judge's decision. Reporters gathered in groups, trying to get a sense of how the public was reacting. The case had become a national sensation, and now, everyone was watching. For Mark's family, though, the weight of the situation was far more personal. It wasn't just about headlines, it was about their son, their brother, their friend. And right now, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Back inside the courtroom, Mark sat still, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't speak, didn't move, but inside, his heart was racing. The judge had said that the witness's testimony would be investigated, but that didn't mean it would be accepted. There was still a slim chance that everything would fall apart. But Mark refused to let that thought consume him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. The truth had been spoken, and now, all they could do was wait for the justice system to do its job. His lawyer, Mr. Jacobs, leaned in and whispered to him, "We've made progress today, Mark. I know it's hard, but stay strong. We're getting closer to the truth." Mark nodded silently, his eyes focused on the judge. His family had always taught him to believe in what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were against him. Today, he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who believed in him. And he wouldn't give up, not now, not ever. The road to justice was long, but for the first time, it felt like it was finally heading in the right direction. The following weeks were filled with a tense stillness that hung over Mark's family. The judge's decision to further investigate Sergeant Daniel Collins's testimony had caused an unexpected delay, but the more time that passed, the more hope began to grow. There was a sense that the truth would eventually come to light, and that perhaps Mark would soon be freed. But despite the glimmers of optimism, his family couldn't shake the uncertainty that clouded every moment. Their son, their brother, was still behind bars, his name dragged through the mud by the accusations. And with every passing day, the questions kept mounting: who would finally stand up for him? Could justice truly prevail? Outside the courtroom, the case had become a national topic of conversation. The media continued to cover every development, but for Mark's family, the news reports were both a reminder of the battle ahead and a small source of hope. The focus now was on the investigation into Collins's testimony. Could the claims be verified? Were there more witnesses who could corroborate his story? These questions were slowly being answered, and the public began to watch more closely, as though they were invested in Mark's fate. Mark's mother, Janet, spent her days pacing around the house, unable to focus on anything for too long. She couldn't help but think about the long nights she spent worrying about her son. When she closed her eyes, she could still picture Mark as a young boy, full of energy and enthusiasm, eager to make his mark in the world. The child she had raised seemed so far removed from the man who now stood accused of a crime he didn't commit. Janet had always been proud of Mark's choice to join the Marines. It had been his dream to serve his country. She could never have imagined that the dream would lead him to this. Every day, Janet and her husband, Bill, would gather around the kitchen table, their faces set with determination. They refused to let the negative thoughts overpower them. They would stay strong for Mark, as he had always stayed strong for them. Their friends and family offered support, but nothing could replace the feeling of helplessness they had. The uncertainty of the situation gnawed at their hearts, and every day they went to bed hoping that the next morning would bring news of Mark's release. In the courtroom, the investigation into Sergeant Collins's testimony continued. The defense team, led by Mr. Jacobs, worked tirelessly to track down any information that could confirm Collins's claims. Meanwhile, the prosecution, led by Lisa Harris, had grown more focused on discrediting the witness, attempting to find any reason to undermine his credibility. The battle was no longer just about Mark's innocence, it had become a full-blown war of wills, with both sides determined to come out on top. Despite the mounting pressure, Mark remained surprisingly calm. He had learned over the years that sometimes, the most difficult battles were the ones fought silently. And this, he knew, was a battle he couldn't fight alone. His thoughts were never far from his family, and he often wondered how they were coping with everything. But through it all, he remained confident in one thing: the truth would eventually come out. No matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the path seemed, he knew he wasn't guilty. And that, he believed, would be enough. One afternoon, Mark's lawyer, Mr. Jacobs, received a phone call that would change everything. The investigation into Collins's testimony had uncovered something unexpected: more evidence that supported the claim that Mark was innocent. The new information came in the form of a security camera footage, which showed another man entering the area where the crime had occurred. This man, someone no one had previously identified, was seen meeting with a group of individuals, and his actions were suspicious. What was more, the man had a history of criminal activity, something that the prosecution had not uncovered until now. Mr. Jacobs wasted no time in bringing this new evidence to the judge. The defense team now had something concrete to present, something that further undermined the prosecution's case. The footage clearly showed that Mark was not in the area when the crime had occurred, and it cast serious doubt on the idea that he was involved in any way. It was a breakthrough that the defense had been waiting for, and it felt like a small victory in the battle for justice. The court reconvened the following week, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Mark's family took their seats in the front row, their eyes focused on the judge. They knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The defense would present the new evidence, and it could very well be the turning point in the trial. Janet's heart raced as she glanced at Bill. They had waited so long for this, and now, everything hinged on this one moment. Mr. Jacobs stood before the judge, holding up the security footage for all to see. "Your Honor, we have obtained new evidence that directly challenges the prosecution's case," he began. "This footage shows another man in the area during the time of the crime. This individual was not identified by the prosecution, but it is clear from the video that he is the one who was involved, not Sergeant Stevens." The room fell silent as the judge watched the footage. The video clearly showed a man meeting with a group of shady individuals, and it was obvious that he was doing something illegal. Mark's family held their breath as the judge absorbed the new information. This was the breakthrough they had hoped for, the moment when the truth was finally being revealed. The prosecution, caught off guard by this new development, immediately stood to respond. Lisa Harris, though visibly rattled, maintained her composure. "Your Honor, while this footage may show an individual in the area, it does not conclusively prove that this man is responsible for the crime. We still believe that Sergeant Stevens was involved, and we intend to continue presenting our case." But the judge wasn't swayed. He looked at the prosecution and then at Mark's defense lawyer. "I will not make a decision based on speculation. However, this new evidence will be considered carefully. We will take the time necessary to investigate this further before moving forward." For Mark's family, the judge's response was a breath of fresh air. The truth was no longer being ignored. The evidence was on their side, and they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't over yet, but the path ahead was clearer than it had been in a long time. In the following days, the investigation into the new footage continued. The authorities were able to track down the man seen in the video, and it was confirmed that he had been involved in a string of illegal activities. The evidence was mounting, and it became increasingly difficult for the prosecution to argue that Mark had anything to do with the crime. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day of the final ruling arrived. The judge called the court to order, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest. His family sat at the edge of their seats, waiting for the moment they had prayed for. The judge's decision was clear. Based on the new evidence presented, and after careful consideration of all the facts, I find that Sergeant Stevens is not guilty of the charges against him. The case is dismissed. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and disbelief. Mark's family, tears in their eyes, stood to embrace each other. They had fought for this moment, and now, it had arrived. Mark was free. The nightmare was over. As he stood there, surrounded by his family, Mark felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had always believed in the power of truth, but now, he knew that justice had finally been served. The battle had been long, and it had been hard, but in the end, it was worth every moment. The world may never fully understand the toll this had taken on him and his family, but for Mark, the victory was sweet, and it was all that mattered.